If you fail to protect your bike correctly, parts of it could easily corrode, which is super heartbreaking, especially for those of you with a brand new bike or a super expensive bike. So in this video, I'm going to explain some simple ways to protect your bike from corrosion and explain what the hell it actually is, and also dispel some common myths and questions which I'm often asked. Corrosion, or rust to give it its common name, is a huge problem. Not only does it affect the cosmetic look of some parts, it also can affect the structural integrity, which is a massive, massive issue. And the worst thing of all is it's often found in places where you wouldn't typically look for it. And I'll explain where those are in just a minute, because first thing we need to do is explain what the hell corrosion and rust actually is, because there's a difference. Rust is a common name given to corrosion which forms on parts which contain iron inside them. Now, the way that rust is formed happens in varying different levels. It could be a light brown coating on the surface of the metal, or it could be a deep, thick crust encasing the whole component. Now, rust is actually formed due to a chemical reaction between iron contained within the metal and oxygen in the air with the presence of water or moisture. And then this forms what's called iron oxide. Now, it's actually the iron which reacts with the oxygen, and that can be found within parts of our bikes which are made up of steel, such as your chain, bolts, or various bearings around your bike. Aluminium parts, on the other hand, technically can't go rusty because they contain no iron. They still can corrode, however, and that is a reaction between the aluminium, oxygen, and water. And what does that form? Well, it forms aluminium oxide, and that is kind of similar to rust, but it takes a different color. It's more of a white and gray color. Thankfully though, protecting your bike from corrosion is relatively simple, and the most important thing to do is do your absolute best to keep it dry, because that way, if there's no moisture, there's less chance of any reaction between the oxygen and either the aluminium or the iron. Having said it's important to keep your bike dry, I'm not suggesting you don't ride in the rain ever, because that would be ridiculous. But every time you wash your bike or you do go on a wet ride, you need to just spend 10 minutes cleaning and wiping the bike down and drying it as best as possible with a clean cloth that is also soft. But it's important to pay particular attention to the areas that are difficult to get to, where moisture can collect and develop. Now, one little gadget I've got to help me do this is a small little electric air duster. And it's super helpful to just blow moisture out of the gaps, like the headset and areas which are difficult to get to. It's not crucial, but it's something that I find particularly helpful. Now, provided that you've dried your bike correctly, where you store it isn't actually that crucial. So damp garages should be okay, provided you've dried your bike correctly in the first place. But what about areas which you still can't access to dry? How do we go about protecting those? Well, that is where grease comes into this. Applying grease to components or parts is going to protect them from moisture and oxygen in the air, which is essentially going to limit the ability for corrosion to form. I'm talking along the lines of the thread on bolts, the thread on bottom brackets, the external areas of bearings. I'm not specifically talking about the inside of bearings, because obviously they have grease in for lubrication. But by applying grease to these different components, you can stop the moisture building up, and therefore corrosion is going to be limited. Now, by using a reputable brand of grease or a thicker grease, it's going to mean it's going to stay in place longer and avoid being washed out by degreasers, which makes your life a little bit easier because you haven't got to spend time taking everything apart and reapplying more grease. The most common part of your bike to go rusty is the chain. That's because it's so exposed to the elements. What you're trying to achieve is to keep the chain clean, free from moisture, and correctly lubricated. It's super important, hence why we've made quite literally hundreds of videos about it. In terms of limiting the corrosion as best as possible, an oil-based lubricant tends to be better than a wax-based lubricant, and it makes life a little bit easier because the properties of it lend themselves towards restricting corrosion. However, if you keep your chain dried correctly, corrosion isn't going to be an issue. Areas which are prone to corrosion but not easy to see but are super crucial to check are things like the clamps underneath the lever hoods, seat posts on bikes which are not made from carbon fibre, pretty much the thread on any bolt of your bike. Pay particular attention to the thread on bottom brackets, and then also quick release threads and axles as well. I would suggest after, say, a lot of riding in winter or lots of indoor training, it's good practice to replace your bar tape, and then at the same time you can inspect those lever clamps thoroughly, because as you sweat over the front of the bike and the handlebars in particular, the salt which is in our sweat will accelerate the rate of corrosion. Other ways to prevent rust or corrosion is to apply paint or some kind of special surface treatment. Now, I'm not talking about threads or bolts here, I'm talking about frames, and in particular, metal frames, because that is the reason, partly other than the aesthetic look, as to why they're painted. Now, if you do have a metal frame and then some of the paint is chipped or deeply scratched and you can see the metal surface underneath, in order to protect it, you simply need to apply some new paint or match the colour up with something like a nail varnish, for example. Okay, a couple of myths and common questions I'm asked about rust. So, can carbon fibre go rusty? No. Can titanium go rusty? Pretty much a solid no. Also a question I'm asked is, how long does rust take to form? Well, it can be as little as just a few hours. I think most of us can probably admit we've washed our bikes, put them away and gone back to them the day after and gone, oh god damn it, crap, my chain has gone all rusty. So there's your answer to that. But how quickly rust actually takes to form varies on a number of different factors, like the levels of moisture involved and also the salt content in that moisture, hence why our sweat is so corrosive. And then also, can rust be removed from components? It's a kind of yes and no answer. Light surface rust, yes, that can be removed, but any deep rust which has gone into the surface and negatively impacted the component is going to have an impact on its strength. So in that case, I would say that you need to replace that component with a new one, and then make sure you keep it dry and apply some grease to it. So there you go, those are some simple tips and hacks to help you limit the amount of corrosion and rust which forms onto your bike, and also explain what the hell rust actually is. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a big thumbs up, click subscribe, turn your notifications on, and also let me know in the comments section down below if you have any tips of your own, and I don't know, what's the worst ever rusty part you've seen on your bike. Right, see you later.